guys, welcome back to the Discipline Life podcast, the place where we talk all about power differential relationships and domestic discipline. I'm Aria, and this is my husband, Coda.
Hello, everyone.
And on today's episode, we are going to be talking all about reasonable expectations and how to set reasonable expectations and be reasonable in the expectations you set. All of those good things.
Being reasonable.
But before we get into today's topic, if you are listening to us on YouTube and you haven't yet, please do consider subscribing. It really helps the channel out. And when you subscribe, click the notification bell so that you are notified when we upload new content. For bonus content as well as early access to the podcast, consider joining us on Patreon. The link is down in the description box.
Yeah. And thank you to those that we've seen on Patreon already. I know we
Yes.
thank them towards the end of the show, but it's been
awesome.
Pretty awesome to see that. So
Anyway,
Yeah.
being reasonable in expectations. So I guess...
no one struggles with that.
Right. I guess my thought process for this episode was that sometimes we can hear about stories, and again, the internet is where I pull most of my information, blogs, personal accounts, stuff like that. And sometimes it's hard to sift through what is real, what is fantasy, what is coming from personal experience, or what is like an imagined scenario.
Yeah.
And sometimes if you're trying to do this type of relationship structure in your real life and you're reading these sources, sometimes these sources depict situations and scenarios that are not realistic and not reasonable. And so I just thought it would be a good topic to talk about what is reasonable and where those lines should be drawn.
And maybe this is an area that you don't even realize you're struggling in your relationship because you don't realize that your expectations are unreasonable. And so that was another reason as we were talking about this, that this is probably a good topic, because this is something that we have, I think, struggled with in our own relationship from the standpoint that some of the things that we struggled with early on, and even sometimes now, I mean, I'm not going to be so presumptuous to say that we don't struggle with some of this now, is unrealistic expectations. And I think unrealistic expectations can also be, it's either a part of this or it can also be translated as assumptions.
True.
And poor assumptions. And assumptions are, Aria can tell you in our family, I always talk about all the time about having proper assumptions or not assumptions at all, because those can be really bad. Those can be really bad for a relationship.
And I think it's good to point out that unrealistic expectations can happen from both sides.
Yeah. Yeah.
So when I initially thought of this topic, I was thinking about scenarios I've read online where, a husband comes home, maybe it's 5:30 and dinner is not on the table, so he punishes his wife.
I've never done that, by the way.
No, because I feel like can be an unrealistic expectation.
Yes.
And I mean, maybe if it's a chronic issue, maybe if you've talked about it, you've discussed that that's what's expected. However, as a one-off, or if you haven't discussed it before, or, things happen, life happens, life gets busy, it's not realistic to say that dinner has to be ready exactly on the dot
at 6:00 every day or whatever the time is.
Right, without any variation in there, right? And I think that sometimes you have to look at attitude and intention more than the productivity.
Yeah, right. I would agree with that.
And so if the issue is that the wife is unwilling to cook dinner or
Then that's a
has a
different
bad
story.
attitude around
Right.
cooking dinner, then that's a different scenario. But just say that, oh, she's willing, she has a good attitude about it, but, maybe her schedule got set back because something happened during the day that was unforeseen and out of her control.
Yeah.
It's not reasonable to punish her for that.
Right. Right. Because, gosh, we've heard of scenarios where this has happened because dinner was supposed to be at 6 and it was like 6:03. Right?
Right.
And again, I don't know if that was a real story or not, but it was out there. And regardless of whether it was real or not, that's not a realistic expectation. And that's not exactly okay to have happen.
And so as the husband or the man setting the rules, you have to have realistic expectations of what can and cannot happen and have reasonable caveats for those things. However, from the wife's perspective, you have to have realistic expectations of what your husband can and cannot do.
Right.
As well. Because I know that sometimes I'm like, well, I want you to be more strict and I want you to hold me accountable to the T. And I think that comes from a place of wanting structure and wanting predictability. But at the same time, I have to be realistic from the standpoint that you are going to give allowances for, I'm supposed to be in bed at, let's use a more reasonable bedtime than my actual bedtime. Let's say
like 11 o'clock.
Yeah, I was about to say, if I'm supposed to be in bed at 11 o'clock and I come to bed at 11:03,
right.
You're like, okay, that's reasonable. That was on time. And I'm like, man, I was late. Obviously, like, I can't have the expectation that you're going to come down hard on me for that.
3 minutes past or
right,
something like that.
Because that's within a reasonable
time frame.
Buffer.
Yeah.
Where, if I push 10 minutes out, 15 minutes out, then it becomes more of like an intentional tardiness.
Right. Right.
But it's unrealistic for me to expect you to respond a certain way for every minor mistake I make.
Right. Right.
It's also unrealistic for me to expect you to have the energy, time, and desire to uphold punishment every single day.
That's true too.
You know what I mean? And not that punishment would happen every single day, but let's say something happens on a night where you're working later. You don't want to come home and deal with that.
Not particularly, no.
And sometimes you do and you have to, but if you're like, hey, I am physically, mentally exhausted, I cannot uphold this punishment in a way that is productive and fulfilling to our goal.
Right.
You're going to wait till tomorrow.
You betcha. Yeah.
And I have to be okay with that. I can't hold that against you. I can't have the expectation of like, this needs to happen right now.
Right.
And so, so those unrealistic expectations can happen on both sides of the coin. So how do we change that mind frame? How do we change that, thought process?
Thinking?
Yeah, that way of thinking. And how do we reframe our thought processes, reframe our thinking to be more reasonable and be more realistic in the expectations that we set? Because I don't think we can get around expectations.
Yeah.
Even as a wife, I don't think that you can live with no expectations of your husband.
Oh, come on.
No. And definitely as a husband setting rules and guidelines for the home, you absolutely can't get around having expectations.
Right.
But we need to learn how to be balanced in the approach and how to be reasonable.
Yeah. And and I'm gonna try not to make this political or even bashing some of the things that are out there. But the perfect example is just look around in our society, really as a whole. Our society doesn't do a very good job with having reasonable expectations when it comes to anything. So what do we have to do with that? We have to remember that we don't need to look necessarily outside of our relationship. We need to sit down and talk about reasonable expectations for our relationship. And that's going to look different than even Ari and I's relationship. Your relationship is going to look completely different.
Every relationship will be different because circumstances are different, structures are different, personalities are different. And so even the expectations that I had on me 5 years ago are different than they are now.
Yeah, right. As you make progress, too, they're going to change.
Right. And
with
so
things.
But if you have small children or multiple small children, your expectations need to accommodate what you've got going on in your life.
Exactly.
Or if you have, teenagers or your kids are out of the house, then the expectations can look a lot different than they were before.
Yeah, and then that kind of brings me to my second point, which is, okay, don't and as of course I'm saying, don't look at any outside stuff, but then you're listening to our podcast. So what I mean is don't look at outside things that are not within this realm.
Don't hold yourselves accountable to someone else's circumstances.
There we go. That's what I'm trying to say. Exactly. And so then my second point is that you've got to sit down and see, are your expectations, do you have too many? We've talked a lot about on this podcast that sometimes we had to look at the rules and go, we got way too many here. Maybe you've got too many. Maybe you don't have enough.
Which is something that we have recently come to, where we were feeling very overwhelmed. We pulled way back, and then we realized a few weeks later there wasn't enough structure.
Yeah, we pulled too much back.
Right.
Therefore...
And so we've been on both sides of that coin, and we've let that pendulum in our own relationship swing too far one direction and then too far the other. And I feel like we're trying and hopefully accomplishing some balance in that.
And so, that's exactly my point, is then if you're struggling with feeling like he is being reasonable or she's being reasonable, if you're struggling in that area with somebody in the relationship is not being reasonable enough, you don't think, sit down and look at those rules, look at the tier system, look at everything that you put together and say, okay, are we struggling because we don't have enough here, or we have too many? And you'll know you'll have too many if you're looking at it and you're going, wow, there's like a gazillion rules here, and you won't have enough. And this may sound very, very simple if you just have a few. Yeah, and you've got, and again, each relationship is going to have to figure out what is the healthy medium for them. But that's something you got to take a look at because then it'll make the expectations easier. I wouldn't say we've got it perfect yet, because I don't think perfection is attainable. But I think we're finally getting to a point where I feel like, and I want to know what Arya thinks, is that we've got I think we've got a good balance of rules and expectations.
I would agree with that. I think that I am still trying to find that balance within my own structure, because at least the way our relationship works is you set the broad expectations, and then I have freedom within those broad expectations.
Right, that's true.
To structure my day how I need to structure it in order to meet those expectations.
Right.
So you have not sat down and told me, okay, you need to do this at this time. It's just, hey, this needs to be done.
Yeah.
And then I get to decide when to do that.
To do those things, right.
And so I think I'm still trying to figure that out on my end, but the expectations you have are not unreasonable. And you do allow for caveats, and you do allow for, certain things. For instance, there's an expectation that I keep the kitchen clean.
Mm-hmm.
However, the way our budget works and the way things work just in general, it makes more sense for me to shop for our groceries once a month. And
Mm-hmm.
then I just do little produce.
Just little things
Yeah,
here and
little
there.
things
Right.
here and there for during the other weeks. But the bulk of our shopping is done once a month. And you know that when I do that, the kitchen's going to be kind of a wreck for a few days.
Right, right.
And it's not that I'm being lazy or, it's just that I have to prep a lot of things or I have to repackage things in order to get them to where they need to go. And that just takes time.
Yeah.
But you're not going to punish me because the counters are cluttered when I just went and did a stock up
Right, right.
grocery shopping trip.
Right.
You're going to allow me to have a couple of days. Now, if it went more than 3 days, you might say something at that point.
Right. Yeah.
But it usually takes a day or two to get everything organized again.
Yeah.
And so that's just one example of how you can have an expectation, but then have a reasonable exception to the rule.
Right. And again, this goes back to always, we probably touch on this on every podcast, but it's because it's so important. Going back to the conversations, having conversations in your relationship. Gosh, we talk and I don't want this to sound like, oh my gosh, as soon as we think we got something licked, we have to go talk about it again. That's not what I mean when I say this, but there are things that I think sometimes I'm like, man, okay, we got that. And then I'm like, oh, we're having a conversation about it again. But that's not a bad thing because we're trying to stay on the same page. We're trying to continue this to move forward. And so I would say that's an expectation that I'm working hard to change is don't necessarily check the box on something and say, okay, we never have to talk about that again. We never have to worry about that again. No, just say, okay, we've talked about that. Hopefully we won't have to talk about it for a while. But when it comes back up, hopefully it will be tweaking that idea rather than starting at square one with that same idea again.
Well, and I want to just encourage everyone to say that we're just like you guys from the standpoint of we have busy lives. We have schedules that change throughout the year. There might be some people out there that they have very predictable schedules
Right.
all the time.
Which, by the way, if you do, I kind of envy you. No.
But I think the majority of people, especially in our age range, we're in our 30s.
Yeah.
And I think the majority of people in their 30s and 40s, especially if you have kids, you have changing sports schedules. You have changing,
Maybe work schedules.
You have school schedules, and you have, other obligations that maybe come and go throughout the year. And I feel like that's very normal in our society. I mean, we're in America, so it's very normal here.
And if you're listening to us outside the U.S., for some of you, you may have something that we don't have that contributes to that.
Right. And so I feel like even if you're like, man, we're in a really good groove, that may change just because your schedule or circumstance changes.
That's true.
You know, there's an expectation in our family that I'm the one that cooks dinner.
Well, because you don't want to eat anything I cook.
But if we
I'm not
had,
very good at it.
Right, but if we had multiple children in after school sports activities, that may look very different.
Yeah. Right.
We would have to figure something out, but, to avoid eating out all the time, but you might allow for more eating out if you have that in your schedule.
Right.
You may, sit down and work out some sort of schedule where, the man and woman can share that responsibility.
Right.
Because even though the man has the authority, the woman's submissive and is under that authority, doesn't mean that the actual tasks have to be assigned according to that structure.
Right.
that's the way it works in our family. Just because I do stay home, I've taken on more of those roles. I'm better at the more traditional domestic duties.
Mm-hmm.
However, if our lives were different, we may have to have worked something else out. And I think, for the short period of time that I did work, we did
I was going to say we
share
did.
more of those
I
responsibilities.
was working a job that was technically full-time, but it was salaried. I was in an interim position, though it wasn't mine. And so when you were working, how many times did we work out, okay, hey, you're going to pick up our daughter at this time and take her for the afternoon? And we just kind of worked it out with our schedules.
Yeah, we worked it out because
we had 2 cars at that point.
we did. That was the
only reason it worked.
I was like, we've been married for how long? 15
years.
15 years, and out of that time frame,
long.
We've only had 2 cars for 2 years of our marriage.
No, it was longer than that, wasn't it?
It's like 2.5 years.
Oh my gosh, you're right. No, as I put it together, I'm like, oh my gosh, you were so right about that. That's crazy.
But regardless,
anyway,
so all that to say, like cooking, cleaning, childcare, those are not inherently submissive tasks.
Right.
Those are just lifestyle tasks.
Just part of life.
And so a husband can cook for his family if that's what works best, and still be the leader and still be the head of household and still have that authority. It's just whatever you work out that works best for your respective schedules and lifestyle and obligations. And then it comes down to, is she holding up her end of the bargain? Is she doing what has been assigned to her when it has been assigned to her? And what is her attitude about it? I think attitude matters so much more than, was this task done perfectly on time, exactly the way it was supposed to be done?
I don't know if you would agree with this, but I can say for me, attitude means a lot. If you have a bad attitude about it, it makes me less likely to want to be reasonable in some areas.
Well, be gracious, because it's
Right.
still reasonable.
Right.
And I would say that that's one area that I think that you could improve on, is sometimes because I have a good attitude, or I'm remorseful, or I'm,
It does make it harder to dish out punishment. Yes, I would agree.
Yes, because I'm
Right.
like, maybe I didn't get something done, and it wasn't because I didn't want to. It's because I had poor time management, or I didn't
Right.
really have a good excuse, but it's not because I had a bad attitude.
Right.
And you're more likely to let that slide. And I think that that's one area that you could improve on, is to say, sometimes
We're working on consistency, as we covered in a few podcasts.
Sometimes product does prevail over intention, but intention matters a whole lot too.
Well, yeah, and I guess the only place that I was going with that is, yes, okay, maybe I can work on it when your attitude is a little better, but I do have to work on it sometimes if your attitude isn't good, that I want to dish out punishment out of frustration, even though then I have to pull back and go, wait a minute, she may have a bad attitude, but she hasn't necessarily violated any of the rules yet. Sometimes.
That's definitely situational, and
Right.
you have to make a judgment call.
That's what I was going to say. So you have to, husbands listening, you have to make a judgment call, and that's something that I've always said, don't take that responsibility lightly. Don't make a rash decision.
However, I think that if I mean, this is just kind of a side note, I guess it kind of fits, but if I'm causing frustration in you because of my attitude, then yeah, maybe I haven't violated any rules, but that does need to be addressed. And so I think it would be appropriate to say, you have a bad attitude and that needs to change. And if it doesn't change, you're going to be punished. And you don't have to necessarily say exactly what that is. You can take some time to consider and pull back and say, okay, out of frustration, I wanted to spank her. However, I don't think, now that I've had time to step away and cool down, I don't think that that's necessarily appropriate, but she needs to write some lines.
Right. And I've done that before.
Right.
Maybe I need to be a little bit more consistent in that area. But yeah,
It doesn't
I
always
have
have
done
to
that
be
before.
severe punishment, but
No.
I think that if I'm invoking frustration in you because of my poor attitude, punishment in some regard is appropriate.
True. And again, this is also, you just brought up a great point of the the expectations and being reasonable with those expectations. That's an area you just said that maybe you don't need a severe punishment. You need to maybe say, okay, but I want to have a severe punishment, but that's my issue. I need to be reasonable. I need to be smart. I need to say, okay, does the punishment fit the crime, like we've talked about before?
Well, and make sure that the punishment is not just feeding your desire to have reparation,
Right.
but more so that it is contributing to the overall goal of edifying the relationship.
Right. And that's what, and exactly, like, you're not going to give the death penalty for someone who got a ticket for speeding. That's not good, reasonable expectations.
And the only other caveat I would put in there is if you have had a really bad day at work and you were driving home and somebody cut you off and you're just primed to be frustrated,
Right. Yeah.
take that into consideration too and really step back and say, and even if you're like, your attitude is awful, you're going to be punished for this. And then you step back and say, no, her attitude really wasn't awful. She was coming to me, in a right attitude and I was just primed for frustration. Then it's okay to go to her and say, you know what, honey, after really assessing the situation, I realized that I was already frustrated before I even walked in the door.
Right.
You didn't do anything wrong. I'm sorry that I jumped to that.
Well, and
that's okay too.
Yeah.
Like, that doesn't undermine your authority to say that.
And the other flip side of the coin is true too. Like, as the woman, if you've been home and the kids have been frustrating, they've been talking back, and you've kind of you haven't gotten anything done the way you wanted to necessarily get it done, and you're frustrated, and he walks through the door, and he's actually had a good day at work and everything, but you're frustrated and everything, you need to remember that is not the time to allow you need to be very, very careful about how your attitude affects how you talk to him.
And I will say that that's definitely an area that I struggle with is, when I've had some hard parenting moments or, maybe I've watched something on YouTube or watched something on
a darn YouTube. No, I'm just kidding.
I enjoy like documentary style content. So maybe I've watched something on a streaming service. And it's just put me in a bad headspace. Or maybe I've been scrolling social media and I start reading comment sections and other people's opinions just start to get in my head and really start to bother me.
Irritate you, yeah.
I have a hard time not allowing that from separating myself from that and not allowing that to infiltrate my mood and attitude towards the people and situations around me.
The thing that I'm really working on to help myself with this is however many of you guys that are listening that are sports fans, I'm a big fan of what Deion Sanders is doing at the University of Colorado. Been a lifelong Cowboys fan, so I'm a big fan of Deion Sanders. And he tells his coaching staff, don't allow work to interfere with home and don't allow home to interfere with work. So in other words, when you're at work, don't let some of the things that you're dealing with at home let that affect your work performance. And when you're at home, don't bring work home. And so when Aria was just talking about coming home and even between the office and coming home, if you were cut off or somebody told you that you were number one or whatever happens, leave that at the door, because that's not your wife's problem. That's not your kid's problem. And you need to learn to be able to say, even if you have to take, I've had times where I've just taken a few extra minutes to decompress. Thank you. And think about what just happened and stop and say, okay, I'm about to go into the house. I'm going to stop and let all of this go before I walk through those doors, because my daughter and my wife don't need my attitude and they don't need my frustration. Where in the past, that wasn't necessarily the case. So.
And so all I was going to say to kind of bring this back around is really realize how even if you've set an expectation and maybe that expectation wasn't met perfectly, but you can tell that there was effort there, don't allow your attitude or external factor how you respond to that
and approach the relationship.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
And so, some things that I think that are just really unreasonable is I do not think that a wife should be punished for the children behaving like children.
Yeah. Have you heard of this happening?
Well, I'm just using that as an example.
Okay.
So,
I just was wondering if you'd heard that happen, but I wholeheartedly agree.
So,
with what you said.
However, there is a caveat there that if your wife is allowing the children, she's allowing them to behave in a way that's unacceptable, she has set a rule or a boundary that is outside of what you have set, then she can be held accountable for that. Right. However, so I actually have read about a man who his wife was letting the children play out in the front yard, and she was allowing them to play out in the street. And they were little, they were toddlers. Yeah. And he came to her and was like, that's unacceptable. That's dangerous. And so she was punished because she was allowing that behavior to happen. However, if she were trying to keep them in a safe area and the toddler ran out into the street,
that's
not
thing.
under her, not with her permission, but
right.
he, I say he because usually little boys are the runners. But if the child ran out into the street to push that boundary, not because she was allowing it, but because he was pushing boundaries, because that's what toddlers do, she shouldn't be punished for that.
Right.
A baby waking up in the middle of the night, you shouldn't be punished for that. A potty training child having a potty accident, a wife shouldn't be punished for that. That's children behaving like children in age-appropriate, expected ways.
Yeah, right.
And those are just parenting moments, and you have to, decide, the best way to approach them for your family. But definitely a wife can be held accountable for how she is monitoring the children and how she is fulfilling her duties as far as taking care of the children, but she shouldn't be punished for behavior that doesn't belong to her.
Right. And so I think the whole point being is that you need to, as the husband, you need to constantly be looking at some of these things when we're talking about being reasonable, looking at them and saying, are these things that are realistic expectations and fair expectations of things that she can actually accomplish and do, and that make her, I would say, ultimately make your relationship better, make her a better person. That's the whole reason.
Right.
For doing that.
Like, if you have a potty training child and they have an accident, she shouldn't be punished because the child had an accident.
No.
However, if she left them in wet clothes for hours and it caused the child to get a rash because she was neglectful of the child, then you can hold her accountable for that, because it is reasonable to expect her to notice that the child has had an accident and to clean them up and change them.
Right. Perfect example is when you brought up this thing about dinner earlier. And the expectation of, okay, if dinner was on the table at 6:03 instead of 6 o'clock, that's not a good enough reason. But if dinner usually is served between 6 and 6:30, she gets it on the table at like 7:30 because she just didn't feel like it, or she was knee deep in a social media, bickering and bantering, or, oh, I just lost track of time because I was, playing Candy Crush. I don't even know Candy Crush is still a thing. But anyway, but you get what I'm saying, as opposed to, hey, we got home late. I was picking up Johnny from soccer practice, and I was doing this and that, and that's the reason dinner got on table. It's the 7:30.
There was an accident on the freeway.
Yeah, there was an accident on the freeway. That's different than being neglectful and just saying, I just decided I didn't want to do it. That's totally different, and you have to...
Or I just wasn't managing my time and didn't realize how late it was getting.
Yeah, and it's like, well, I don't mind if you play the game, but try to not get so knee-deep in what you're doing, and there's going to be consequences for that, so you remember next time. Don't
set an alarm or watch
set an
the
alarm
clock.
or something.
Make
Watch
sure
the clock.
that you're doing what you're supposed to do.
So that we're not eating so late. But again, you have to...
kind of look at the circumstance, because
something that we're lacking someday. Again, I'm trying not to get political, but we're lacking in our society a little bit, which is use common sense. And if you don't know what common sense is, go out and get some.
Well, and personal accountability too,
exactly.
right? I mean,
exactly.
As a wife, if I neglected to get dinner ready on time because I lost track of time, it is a temptation to try to justify myself,
right.
because rather than take accountability for what actually happened, which is I was not managing my time appropriately.
Appropriately, right.
Because there's been instances where I was trying a new recipe. I did not necessarily understand or realize the process. So we ended up having dinner late, not because I wasn't prepared and I just didn't realize how long that particular recipe was going to take. So the next time we had that dish, I planned more appropriately. But that night, and I kind of just made like a little appetizer course to kind of hold us over.
Yeah.
It was the first time I made the sweet and sour chicken, you remember? Because it takes like an hour in the oven. I did not realize that. Because usually chicken cooks way faster. But getting off the subject, you just have to, look at the situation and be reasonable to say, were you late on this because it was actually your fault, or were there circumstances outside
beyond your control? Mm-hmm. Right. And then, like we were talking about, always be in conversation, always be reevaluating the rules and the expectations. I'm always doing that. Even when I check throughout the day in the app that we use and I talk to Aria about all of these things, I'm constantly going, is this still a realistic rule? Is this still a good, reasonable expectation? So that if it's violated and those things happen, I can go, okay, is this a realistic punishment to what has happened? And so you constantly be asking the question, constantly be asking yourself, is everything that we're doing in this domestic discipline relationship, is it reasonable? Is it helping? Or do we need to tweak this because it's actually hurting our relationship?
And also look at, and this is going to be different for everybody, but play into your strengths.
Yeah.
So for us, something like car maintenance is never going to be on my expectations that you have of me, because that is not a strength that I have.
Right.
And even to take the car in to be serviced, that's not a strength that I have, because I could do it. However, I'm not going to understand. I'm more prone to being taken advantage of, as far as like a mechanic talking me into things.
Right.
So that is, but Coda knows more. He's learned, but he knows more about the car maintenance and how to do those things.
I'm still not an expert by any means, guys, but I have learned a little bit about cars.
But he knows how to top off the car fluids and change the oil and stuff like that. And that's something that is so beyond my wheelhouse that it would be unreasonable for you to then say, hey, it's your responsibility to make sure that the car is maintained. in these ways.
Yeah, no, I try to take care of all of that.
However,
Even down to the tires, right? That's something that I
right.
try to just take on and say, hey, that's my responsibility to know when that's supposed to happen.
And then
So,
we kind of share yard maintenance because it's something that I can do. It's not.
and she's better at it.
I wouldn't. Well, I'm better. I'm better at the detail work.
Yes, very much so.
However, because I do so much else in the house, you've taken that on to say I will do it. But if I happen to have time, I
You
will
will
do it.
right.
But it's not an expectation that I do it.
No. And no, it's not at all.
It's
Not at
always
all.
just kind of like I have time. I'm going to help him out. I'm going to do this so that he doesn't have to. And it's kind of like, it's my way of going above and beyond and serving, but it's not an expectation
No.
because you know that because I'm expected to facilitate homeschooling our child, I am expected to
Cleaning the
do all
house.
the cleaning, the cooking, the organization, going through and decluttering our home,
Yeah.
doing a deep clean schedule, do all the laundry, make sure your shirts are ironed. I have all of that going on. And so you know that I just don't have the time for you to reasonably expect me to do regular lawn maintenance.
Right. Exactly.
If I happen to have some extra time, great. But it's
However,
not an
yeah.
expectation because you're reasonable to say you only have so much time and energy in the day
Yeah.
to do certain things, and I'm already asking a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And actually that was a perfect example of what it's not a rule that you do it, and that's something we just try to do to help out each other, more you to me than me to you. But yeah, that's not an expectation because I know, you have some other things on your plate, and that would really be making the list wrong, and that would really make it to where you're stressed out, and none of these things that we're trying to do to help you be a better mom and a better wife, it wouldn't be happening. You'd just be stressed out, and it would make things worse. Which is one reason why we're telling people always take a close look at the rules and see if you've got too many, because that would really make it hard for you.
And there's certain things. We don't live in a area with an HOA, so the only people that get kind of grumpy about the way our lawn looks is the city, and it has to get pretty bad before they come around.
I would say they're pretty reasonable. They really are.
And so, the only thing is that in our alley where our utility meter is they get pretty grumpy about that. And so I always try to look at, do you have time? Because you are working full time. You're in school full time, not currently because it's summer, but typically through the year, you're in school full time. You have certain obligations because of those things. And so I try to say, hey, even if I neglect something in the house, I know that we're going to get fined if this doesn't happen. If you don't have time, then I make a judgment call to say, okay, I'm at least going to do the alley so that the meter reader doesn't report us.
The reporter.
And so there's always kind of a give and take, right? And so sometimes I will come to you and be like, hey, I didn't vacuum today, and the kitchen's just, kind of where it's at because I did this for you.
Right.
And so you don't hold me accountable to those things being undone because you see it's not because I was being lazy. It's not because I was being neglectful. It's because I realized that we had to get this other thing done kind of on a deadline.
Right.
So that's another example of being reasonable to, hey, if something comes up, something else might have to be put off.
Right. Exactly. Well, I think we covered it.
I think so.
I think we covered it. So, do you want to give your usual spiel here?
We just want to thank you guys for supporting us on Patreon. The support over there has just been amazing. We really appreciate you guys.
And thank you all of you who subscribed on YouTube.
Yes, thank you for subscribing on
I mean, it's
YouTube.
amazing. I cannot believe it.
When I started this channel, I really wasn't sure what the response was going to be. When we hit the
Neither of
first
us were.
100 subscribers, I thought that was amazing. I thought, if we ever hit 500, that would just blow my mind, and we're halfway there.
Yeah, I can't believe that.
And so
Can't believe
it's
that.
just,
I mean, if we don't hit 500, we're still happy. Like, we're just amazed at how many of you have subscribed and have listened. Thank you.
yeah, we really appreciate all of your support, however you do that. And
So don't forget to leave a question or a comment in the comment section if you
let
want
us
to.
know what you thought about this topic. What are
Yeah.
some expectations that you find unreasonable? What are some expectations that you think are reasonable that we didn't cover?
Yeah.
Obviously, every situation and circumstance is different, but we can all learn from each other. So,
Absolutely. And did we say the email if they want to send a question or a comment?
we do have, if you want to send us a direct email privately to ask a question or send us a comment, our email is thedisciplinedlifepodcast@gmail.com. That is typed out for you in the description box.
Woohoo.
As well as our Instagram handles if you're interested in following. We're not super active on Instagram, but we're trying. We're trying.
But again, we appreciate you listening, and we hope these have been helpful.
All right, guys. We'll talk to you next time.
Talk to you next time.
Bye.
Bye.